For the past few days, I've tested almost 40 different semi-unique teams just to get this guide video out, and I nearly had a pseudo mental breakdown. But now that all of that is done, welcome to the guide video, notably for the new Luna 1 or version 6.0 Stygian Onslaught. So being the last of the 3 guide videos, this will have a little bit of a revamp as well as some new style visuals to assist those who don't really intend to watch the video and at least help my presentation for that case. And just a minor update for all my Onslaught guides moving forward, I will no longer be covering the guide for the Menacing difficulty, mostly because the Fearless variant and the Menacing variant aren't that much different from each other in terms of mechanic. And even if it is, you can always fight the overworld variant, or if not, their relatives in the Abyss to get a rough idea of how they actually work. So mostly I will only be cover tips regarding the Fearless difficulty from now on. So the bosses this time around are the Aeonblight Drake, the Battle-Hardened Rock Crab, and lastly the Battle-Hardened Fireblade Shock Trooper. So let's start off with the Aeonblight Drake. The Aeonblight Drake has about 6 million HP for the Fearless variant, almost over double that at Dire with about 14 million HP. It does have 70% physical resistance, while 10% to other elements, but nobody runs physical nowadays, so that's not really that big of an issue. The notable mechanic that makes it different from the regular Aeonblight Drake is that it always gains 200% resistance to the element that did the most damage to it on these respective HP thresholds, being at 75%, 50%, and lastly 25%. So it also no longer has any more weak points, so bringing a bow character to try to shoot it down or stun it, that will no longer happen. However, the battle will start in the ground, and whenever the battle does start with a 2-minute timer, you have about a 45-second window to reach each of the damage threshold before it starts flying, of which when it does, you're basically unable to hit it if you run melee characters. So the general recommendation is to run a multi-elemental or a dual DPS team, and just a minor tip here, staying in front of it while attacking it will give you more time because it will execute attacks or 2-piece combo attacks, which could actually give you a little bit of a leeway to stall its flying move. And I did a bit of testing, and as you can see in the image down here, these are the respective thresholds. Like 75% is when you reach about in between the F and the A of its name of the fav, while 50% is roughly between the M and O of the motion word, and lastly 25% is on the first E of the perpetual name. This will be a bit helpful for you just to get a rough idea of how much time you have left before it's about to enter the threshold, or if not, start its flying. Or if that's not very obvious, you can always look at its animation where it acts like kind of stun, and that's basically your cue that he already or it's about to enter the extra boosted rest state. As for the best units from all the almost 40 different teams that I tested so far, unfortunately most of them are very exclusive and really good, notably the Natlan units. Like, I'm gonna list all of this and then I'll explain with the runs playing in the background. So we have Morlani and Mawika. Morlani Vape is definitely very strong, but I think so far from all the teams that I tested, you have to run Mawika in her teams because otherwise Mawika just does so much damage as a dual DPS that if you run any other unit, the damage that you're going to get just simply isn't enough to meet the next threshold for you to bring Morlani back. And you can of course run the Kinish Emily team, but unfortunately, once again, you also kind of want Mawika in this case because there's not really a strong enough pyro unit unless you do have a very strong, like we're talking extremely strong, good ER stat stick Shangling that's able to carry the second element in your team. You can technically bring Chaska in like a Chaska Overvape with Bennett or Roron or Bennett Inefa. However, I do recommend getting at least her R1 or if not a really strong 5-star weapon like Aqua Simulacra, or if not something like Skyward Harp, because otherwise her damage simply is going to be lacking. For the other Natlan units, we of course do have Veressa with the double overloaded team. Just run 1 Electro DPS and 1 Pyro DPS and you should be good to go. Mawika is going to be the best of slot here. I've seen someone clear with the 4-star variant with Chevreau, Yansan, and Shangling. However, I feel like you do need really good stats for both Veressa and Shangling to make it work, so that's one thing to keep in mind. And then Shilonen here is just to work with Molani. Arlecchino, I tested the team with Arlecchino and Raiden, but the Raiden does require Constellation 2 in order to actually make it work, but it is quite a pleasant surprise because this team could actually clear. And then Navia does work, but of course Navia, Shilonen, and of course Mawika, there's really no other way around it. If for some reason you're not using Skirk for the Shock Trooper, you can of course run the Skirk Priest team over here, but preferably I think I forgot to put Yelan. I'll just post-edit me, just put Magical Yelan on the side. Right, that's right, very cool. So instead of Shenhe, you actually kind of want to bring Yelan here so that you have a good balance between Hydro and Cryo DPS. Of course, your teams do have to be very well invested. And the supports being Chevreau, Bennett, Yansan, and Shang Ling. So as the footage plays right now, the one thing I will have to note for Maoika teams is that you do want to learn and preferably master the N1CD combo, because that is what we learned from the previous Stygian Onslaught. I think it was version 5.8, where this is the most optimal combo for on-field Maoika to deal the most amount of damage. You can probably try to spam the charged attack spam and just go brain dead about it, but if you're at this point, you should generally just stop being too casual about it and try to learn a little bit, because otherwise I think your damage will fall off unless you do have constellations on your Maoika, or if not her own weapon, the 1000 Blazing Suns. Now, the funniest Emily Molani team, this is the one thing I didn't exactly mention just now, but maybe you don't have Maoika here. However, this does require you to have Kinish, Emily, and Molani. And in the 4th slot, my recommended one is to simply give Scrolls of the Cinder City to your Pyro Traveler, give him a bit of faff, and this is surprisingly a team that could clear. Though granted, I did this on a viewer account and they had C1R1 Kinish, so I can imagine you probably need a good amount of investment. However, the Molani is kind of half-baked build. It's a very above average but not top 5% kind of Molani, so maybe you can offset Kinish's investment by having R1 Molani, or maybe a really good builds for all 3 of these DPS. But this is a funny team that I can definitely recommend. The Arlecchino Raiden build, if you do have a very good like Raiden, I'm talking like 230 CV Raiden with a catch or Fav if you want to, and then a very well built Arlecchino regardless of what build you have, this is something you can also consider, because both units deal enough damage for you to be able to deal with the multi-elemental feature that the Aeonblight Drake has. Now, unfortunately, I haven't really tested the Skirk team because I myself do not have Skirk, but I'm sure this will work to some extent. However, that is something you will do if you don't have, or you already have something to deal with the Fatui Shockblade Trooper. For the second boss, the Battle-Scarred Rock Crab is essentially a Bloom-centric crab. In Fearless, he has about 5.8 million HP, while Dire has almost double that at 10 million. It has about 10% normal resistance to anything in that regular state, and it loses all the way to minus 30% at its weakened state after you break the shield. So the whole premise is like this. Whenever it starts, it will fly in the air and create a shield, and then briefly after that, it will generate about a bunch of Hermit Seeds around you. I think there's about 6 of them, and then it will continuously generate Hermit Seeds on the outer radius. What you want to do here is apply any bloom damage to the seeds to make it fly, and this will help you break the boss's shield and bring it down. This will require a minimum of 6 seeds to activate, and when I say any type of bloom damage, I mean regular bloom, hyper bloom, Burgeon, and of course Lunar Bloom. However, Burgeon is not recommended because, as I mentioned in the 5th point here, applying Pyro to the seeds will cause them to basically detonate most of the time and very likely one-shotting you in the process. So bringing Pyro here is not exactly recommended. Now, activated seeds will actually home in like it's Hyper Bloom and deal 500% of the damage based on the amount of bloom damage you dealt to activate the seed. So if your Hyper Bloom did 30k, the activated homing seed will do 150k, and I think the cap is like 1.5 million. So unless you're like a dolphin whale or something, I don't think you can reach that number realistically. And also my recommendation, if you do run these teams, is try to prioritize activating the seeds over dealing damage to the crab, because the seeds themselves is going to be a huge portion of your damage. While dealing Hyper Bloom damage is nice, I think you want to do a bit of both, where you try to activate Hyper Blooms against the boss, but you also want to make sure you activate Hyper Bloom on the seeds that it spawns nearby. Now, as for the best units that I have tested and I do recommend, it's mostly centered around Bloom and Hyper Bloom themes, notably the Dendro units being Nahida. Of course, if you do have Nahida, if you don't have Nahida, you're gonna be it's gonna be a little bit tricky. However, if we go through down the list for the Hydro units, Nilo Bloom is absolutely great because this challenge requires you to have a Bloom that explodes really fast, that has massive AoE, and Nilo Bloom is just the right character for that criteria. As for the Hydro units, we have Xingqiu, Yearlan, and Kokomi. Kokomi is one of the better ones in my opinion, because if you build her full EM with 4 Flowers of Paradise Lost, or maybe you run like 4 Gilded Dreams, then she will have a good amount of ownership on the blooms, and on top of that, if you use a charge attack and her Jellyfish, it does have a good amount of AoE to be able to apply Hydro to a massive amount of seeds. Xingqiu and Yearlan, you do want to build an extremely high amount of ER, so make sure you get that out of the way. If you're running Xingqiu and you don't get the burst at the start of the rotation, my recommendation is to try to use your Sack Sword of Faff at the start of the fight before it flies up, and then afterwards, you basically want to run and hug the Hermit Seeds in order to apply Hydro to it. At the very least, you can maybe activate, give or take like 2 to 3 before the Sword Blades or the Rain Swords around you runs out. For the Hyperloom triggers, Cookie is going to be the default one. There's nothing for me to say here, just run a regular Hyperloom Cookie build. Or if you don't have Cookie and your C0 Raiden is rotting in the background, you can of course give her Dragon's Bane and run her on the Hyperloom build too. And I personally prefer Raiden over Cookie, although Cookie does have AoE while Raiden is a bit more enemy target centric. Dendro Traveler is a second best option if you don't happen to have Nahida, or maybe as another unit that you want to run in your Nilo team, simply because Bloom recoil damage has been reduced from 5% to 2%, and Dendro Traveler does AoE Dendro application, which is surprising that our resident Dendro Archon does not have the ability to do so off field. And then of course the last few units, we do have Lorma, which I do not have, but I've seen people do runs with Lorma, and I think it's mostly a very brain dead option. I think I did a Lorma clear on one of my viewers' account. It was definitely not even worth an effort to even try. Alhaitham, I saw gameplay too based on another fellow content creator's guide, but I don't have Alhaitham myself, so I can imagine if you were to run some Hyperloom, the standard Alhaitham Hyperbloom with Cookie, I think his damage should be good enough to compensate for it. Now my Kabe is Consolation Tree, and I only put his recommendation here for Nilo teams. However, the amount of self-healing that he has, and of course the AoE he has for his Claymore, his skill and burst, is pretty nice at applying a decent amount of AoE Dendro to help you trigger those Nilo blooms. Just to add up a bit with the boss, sometimes there will be certain situations where it would be better to just actually trigger more Dendro seeds or more bloom cores rather than actually triggering Hyper Bloom to help you activating the Hermit seed, because let's say the tip that I'm about to give here is notably for Nahida Yelan. Whenever the boss does spawn all 6 seeds all around you, you just hold E with Nahida and just go all the way around to do a full 360 degrees, and then what you want to do is use Yelan's skill to apply Hydro and mark every single one of the seeds. This will cause the amount of bloom cores generated to exceed the limit of, I believe, at 5 cores. So any older cores that are generated past that limit will detonate immediately, and this will help you act as like a pseudo Nilo Bloom, which in turn does basically save you a bit of time by just making all the Hermit seeds trigger within the first few seconds. So if you do happen to run Nahida Double Hydro Hyper Boom with Yelan, this is one thing that you can do. For the last boss, we have the Battle-Scarred Fireblade Shock Trooper. I removed the shock because the name is too long. So it has about 9.2 million HP for Fearless and about 17.2 million at Dire. It has 10% resistance in its normal state, 70% when it activates its shield, and of course minus 40% when it's weakened. The stats are mostly the same, but the difference is that it will retain 10% Electro both in the normal and shielded state, making it so that Electro DPS will gain a benefit here. Now for the mechanics, it will start the fight by creating 3 layers of shield, which is worth about 4.5% HP of its max HP. The shield will take increased damage to Electro Charge damage as well as Lunar Charge damage, and this is recommended because it also pauses the shield's extremely fast self-repair mechanic. So for my bits of testing, you have about a 35-second window to break all shield layers before he creates his ultimate move, striking down about 6 to 8 different lightnings, which are guaranteed to basically two-shot you unless you happen to be flying in the air as Chaska, which is a very niche thing. And breaking each layer will make him not only lose 6% of his max HP, it will also generate elemental orbs, which are about 18 electro units and I think 6 for other elements. You can play around this mechanic where, like, let's say you gain all your energy in the first rotation, you try to farm for it, so by the time you break one shield your second rotation, you would be quite well off with enough energy to possibly use all your beam's bursts. And lastly, he reactivates his shield once every minute. So generally you break it give or take around 1 minute 30 seconds. Around the 30 plus seconds mark, he will do this again to reactivate it, unless you want to stagger him in order to delay the shield phase, or use something like a Skirk freeze team in order to delay it as much as possible. As for the recommended teams, these units are very much not much of a surprise. Purina will fare well with any Electro Charge teams. Inefa here is something that I would put over Fischl, unfortunately simply because Fischl is a bit energy hungry to maintain the uptime of Oz with her elemental burst, and Inefa as a Lunar Charge unit just simply does way too much damage since it bypasses the defense, and I'm pretty sure from all my runs, I can literally do nothing with Furina and Inefa, and she alone can break layers of a shield without Ryu doing a single thing. For another unit, you can technically run Veresa, however I do recommend pairing up together with Shen Yun or a very well-built Veresa, because Veresa on her own doesn't feel like it's enough damage, or maybe you could run like a Chevreau Overloaded team with Mawuika, that might actually be enough damage for you to break through. For the Navia Shilonin here is also a unique one because the team that I tested is actually pairing these 2 units together, or these 4 units, notably with Furina and Innifa. And surprisingly, Navia actually does enough damage to give me a comfortable kill at about 110 seconds, so that's something you can consider. And then we do have the typical Escoffier Freeze team. Keep in mind that unless you have a R1 Skirk, or you have a Shenhe with a well-built Skirk, it's important for you to break 1 layer of the shield by the end of your first rotation. Because for my little bit of testing on my viewer's account, it is impossible for Skirk to clear unless she's able to break at the minimum 1 layer of shield, and this tip applies to any DPS that you bring. If you run a rotation with little to no energy, if you can't break 1 layer of the shield on the first rotation, assume that that run is basically failed because it's impossible for you to actually break all 3 layers in that short amount of time. And then the other units are like Neuvillette. If you run an Electrocharge team, Neuvillette Fischl does kind of work, but I imagine you probably need R1 like Tome of Eternal Flow or C1 or C1 R1 to make it get close to that amount. So that is something I would have to preface before you mention, oh, you can run Neuvillette with Fischl. Yes, you're not wrong, but your Neuvillette does need to have a good build. Just to back up the statement that I just said, I would definitely feel like Neuvillette will require a C1 R1, assuming that your Fischl is extremely underbuilt or happen to be running FAF, because God forbid people actually build ER on their Fischl. But if you do want your Fischl to be able to clear running a C0 R0 Neuvillette, then I would highly recommend at least putting a 5-star weapon or an extremely good Fischl build, because I don't think, for my test, my Fischl is already pretty decent, but stringless alone is not enough. And as for the amount of energy recharge needed to burst every 2 rotations, I do highly recommend putting your Furina and Kazuha together on FAF, which one or whichever that works, and then Fischl at least 130 to 140 ER, because whenever you break the first shield layer with, let's say, Neuvillette's charge attack, at the very least you can swap back to Fischl to absorb all the 18 electro energy particles to guarantee your ability to use elemental burst and resummon Oz for the next rotation. And if you're not able to do this, then you probably just have to go back to the workshop and just try to fix some things here and there. And then Kazuha here, because I saw some people do like Mawika Mono Pyro with Shilona and Kazuha Bennett, but keep in mind you probably need at least Refinement 1, 1000 Blazing Suns to make it work. And to be honest, I don't really have too much to say about this. Like, I generally tested about 39 teams as the moment of this recording, and I haven't tested much of all the 4-star units, but I did test a lot of different variants where I run a 5-star DPS with like the 4-star alternatives, like replacing Innifa with Aurora on Fischl or Xingqiu. My Aino is not built, unfortunately, so I can't exactly bring her to the test, but from what I can see, it's really just a matter of a DPS check for all 3 of its bosses. The Bloom boss is probably the most lenient one by far, because as long as you run like, you can run like a double Hydro Hyper Bloom with Nahida, Xingqiu, Yelan, and Kuki, and my Kuki is level 100 in the footage, but that is a point that you can do because that is enough damage. The Aeonblight Drake will require double elements, so unless you have some variation of all the units I recommended just now, it's going to be a little bit tricky for you to do that. And lastly, the Shock Trooper is going to be the hardest one, and I think most of people or most of the community will agree by far, simply because the DPS check is rather high and you do need some decently well done investment or very specific units in order to tackle him in time. Anyways, I think that's all I can give for this Stygian Onslaught guide. Let me know what you guys think about the new visual format. I did try to make it to be as easily digestible as possible, and I don't want to spend too much time because, like, if I show you these images, I don't have to really explain too much about what teams I can recommend. So if you guys do have any sort of feedback for the new format, and as well as any sort of teams that maybe I can add to the list of my Google Sheets, I'll put a link down to the Google Sheets below. This is a link of all the different teams I've tested, as well as all the builds that I have for my account. Just feel free to check it out. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. If you want to stick around for more endgame content, more endgame guide stuff, click the subscribe button, and I will see you guys next time. This is Ethereal signing off, and I wish you the absolute best of your luck to clear this freaking Stygian Onslaught. Peace out, everyone.